In 1996, on a private estate in southeastern Pennsylvania, a du Pont heir shot an Olympic wrestler in the driveway of a farmhouse and then barricaded himself inside a mansion for 2 days while police negotiated through the walls. The murder shocked the country, but what it revealed was older and stranger than any single crime. The du Pont family had been manufacturing the gunpowder that armed every American war since 1812, had owned enough of the chemical industry to put a synthetic product in nearly every household in the nation, had governed the state of Delaware through a web of elected offices and tax codes designed to protect a single fortune, and had operated, for nearly 200 years, as the closest thing the American Republic ever produced to a ruling dynasty. The killing at Foxcatcher Farm was not the beginning of the family's collapse. It was a symptom of what happens when a dynasty outlasts the institution it was built to serve. The story of that institution begins not in Pennsylvania or Delaware, but in Paris, in the final decade of the 18th century, inside the laboratory of Antoine Lavoisier. Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry, ran the French Royal Gunpowder Works at the Arsenal, and among his students was a young man named Eleuthère Irénée du Pont de Nemours. The elder du Pont, Pierre Samuel, was a political economist of minor aristocratic standing who had advised Louis XVI on matters of trade and taxation. He was, by temperament and conviction, a man of the Enlightenment. His son Irénée was something more practical. Under Lavoisier's instruction at the Arsenal Powder Works, the younger du Pont learned the precise chemistry of saltpeter refinement, charcoal grading, and the milling of black powder to military specification. It was an education that would have remained a curiosity of minor French science had the Revolution not intervened. Lavoisier was guillotined in 1794. Pierre Samuel du Pont was arrested, held in La Force prison, and came within days of execution before the fall of Robespierre reopened the cell doors. The family survived, but the France they had known did not. By 1799, Pierre Samuel had concluded that the Republic offered no future for a family associated with the Ancien Régime. He assembled a small expedition of du Pont relatives and associates, secured financing from a circle of French investors, and sailed for the United States in the autumn of 1799 aboard the American Eagle. The ship carried the du Pont family and a small party of associates. It also carried Irénée's knowledge of gunpowder manufacturing, which was, at that moment, the most commercially valuable piece of technical expertise any immigrant had ever brought to the American shore. The family landed in Newport, Rhode Island, on the 1st of January, 1800. Pierre Samuel imagined a land company, a Jeffersonian agricultural venture that would settle French émigrés on American soil. His son had a different vision. On a hunting trip in the countryside outside New York, Irene du Pont purchased American-made gunpowder and found it crude, unreliable, and dangerously inconsistent in grain size. The powder was manufactured by small regional mills with no standardized process and no understanding of the chemistry that governed detonation velocity and burn rate. Irene recognized immediately that the American market lacked what Lavoisier had given France. A scientifically managed powder works capable of producing military-grade explosives at industrial scale. He chose a site on the Brandywine Creek in northern Delaware, 4 miles from the city of Wilmington. The Brandywine offered reliable water power to drive the stamp mills that crushed and mixed the powder components. The surrounding forest provided willow charcoal. The creek's narrow valley offered natural containment in the event of an explosion, which was not a theoretical concern but a statistical certainty. Gunpowder manufacturing killed workers with regularity. The du Ponts would learn this firsthand. Financing came from two sources that revealed the family's position between two worlds. The French investors who had backed Pierre Samuel's emigration contributed $36,000. The rest came from a personal loan arranged through the offices of Alexander Hamilton's associates in New York. The construction of the mills followed Lavoisier's French design, adapted for the American terrain. Granite walls 3 feet thick on 3 sides, with lightweight roofing on the 4th side facing the creek, so that any blast would vent outward over the water rather than inward toward the adjacent buildings. The architecture itself was an admission that the product would eventually try to destroy the place that made it. The Eleutherian Mills, as the works were called, began production in 1804. The first powder was sold to the federal government. Thomas Jefferson, who had corresponded with Pierre Samuel du Pont on matters of Republican philosophy, was now president of a nation that needed gunpowder more urgently than philosophy. The United States was expanding westward, clearing land with blasting powder, and preparing, however reluctantly, for the military confrontations that expansion would require. Irene du Pont offered a product that was measurably superior to anything else manufactured in America. His powder burned more evenly, detonated more reliably, and cost less per pound than the output of the New England and Pennsylvania mills that had supplied the Continental Army a generation earlier. War of 1812 provided the first great proof. When the United States declared war on Britain, the War Department turned to the Brandywine mills for the bulk of its powder supply. Du Pont delivered. The company produced an estimated 500,000 pounds of gunpowder for the war effort, and when the conflict ended, the relationship between the Du Pont family and the federal government had been permanently established. The family was no longer a collection of émigré chemists running a Delaware mill. It was a strategic supplier, embedded in the military procurement chain of a nation that intended to keep fighting. Irene du Pont understood that this position required more than good chemistry. It required a governance structure that could outlast any individual life. In 1811, he formalized what became known as the Family Compact. The Du Pont Company would not be a corporation in the conventional sense. It would be a partnership, owned entirely by members of the Du Pont family, with profits reinvested in the enterprise and distributions controlled by the senior partners. The partnership agreement prohibited the sale of shares to outsiders and forbade any family member from withdrawing capital without the consent of the senior partners. The business and the family would be, by legal and financial design, the same entity. Irene described the arrangement in a letter to a French associate as one designed to ensure that the prosperity of the concern shall be the personal interest of every member of the family connected with it. The compact carried a provision that revealed the particular calculus of the explosives trade. Because the Brandywine mills sat in a narrow valley, and because black powder detonated without warning, the senior partners and their families were required to live on the mill property, in stone houses built along the creek within range of any blast. The Du Ponts did not merely own the powder works, they inhabited them. If the mills exploded, the owners died alongside the workers. This was not an act of solidarity, it was an act of governance. A family that lived beside the powder had an incentive to maintain the machinery, enforce the safety protocols, and inspect the grinding stones with a diligence that no absentee investor would replicate. The explosions came anyway. In 1818, a detonation at the Hagley Yard killed 40 workers and shattered windows in Wilmington. In 1847, an explosion destroyed the upper mills and killed 18 men. In 1857, another blast killed 5. Irene du Pont himself had survived a catastrophic accident in 1817, but the cumulative toll on the family's workforce was staggering. Between 1802 and 1921, over 228 workers died in explosions at the Brandywine mills. The du Pont family buried its dead, rebuilt the walls, and continued production. The scale of that production deserves its own reckoning. By 1834, 3 decades after the first powder was milled on the Brandywine, the Du Pont Company was producing over 1 million pounds of black powder per year. By 1850, the figure had doubled. During the Civil War, the Brandywine mills and their satellite plants delivered an estimated 4 million pounds of gunpowder to the Union Army, accounting for roughly 40% of all powder consumed by federal forces between 1861 and 1865. The contract value of those wartime deliveries exceeded $2 million, a sum that in the 1860s represented not merely wealth, but political leverage of the First Order. A family that supplied nearly half the Union's powder was a family that no administration could afford to alienate, regulate, or replace. Irene du Pont had died in 1834, 30 years after the first powder was milled. But the structure he had designed, the family compact that bound the Du Ponts to the Brandywine, outlasted him by generations. His sons, Alfred Victor and Henry, took control of the partnership. His grandsons expanded the satellite mills into Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Each generation inherited not merely a company, but an obligation, encoded in the partnership agreement, to live on the property, reinvest the profits, and maintain the family's monopoly position in the American explosives market. The compact did not ask whether each new Du Pont wanted to serve the enterprise. It assumed that service was the price of the name. By the time the Civil War ended, the Du Pont Company was the dominant manufacturer of gunpowder in the United States, and the Du Pont family was the wealthiest family in Delaware. The two facts were inseparable because the family had designed them to be inseparable. The company was the family. The family was the company. And the product that sustained both was the product that the nation required every time it chose to fight, to expand, or to break the earth open for what lay beneath. The War of 1812 had proved the model. But the wars and the westward expansion that followed proved something the Du Ponts had understood from the beginning. A nation addicted to growth could not grow without their powder. The Mexican-American War of 1846 consumed Du Pont powder by the ton. The California gold rush that followed consumed more, not for killing, but for blasting. Miners in the Sierra Nevada needed black powder to break quartz ledges, to tunnel through granite, to open the earth for what it held. The Du Pont Company supplied the military and the miners with equal efficiency, and when the war ended and the gold rush matured into industrial hard rock mining across the Western Territories, the family found itself in possession of a market that did not depend on the irregular rhythm of congressional declarations. War was cyclical, expansion was constant, and expansion required explosives, the way railroads required iron. Henry du Pont, the second son of Irene, understood this better than anyone in the family. He had attended the United States Military Academy at West Point, graduating in 1833, and had served briefly as an Army officer before returning to the Brandywine to manage the powder works. He took control of the company in the 1850s and ran it with the discipline of an ordnance bureau. During the Civil War, it was Henry who managed the expansion of production that made Du Pont the largest supplier of gunpowder to the Union Army, while his son, Henry Algernon du Pont, served as an artillery officer in the Shenandoah Valley and earned the Medal of Honor at the Battle of Cedar Creek. The elder Henry had seen what the family product did at close range, and he understood that quality control was not merely a commercial advantage, but a military necessity. He approached the American explosives market with the strategic clarity of a general who had studied terrain. The terrain, as Henry saw it, was cluttered with competitors. Dozens of small powder manufacturers operated across the eastern states, producing black powder of varying quality for mining, construction, and military contracts. Henry du Pont did not intend to outcompete them. He intended to organize them. In 1872, he convened a meeting of the principal American powder manufacturers and proposed the creation of what became known as the Gunpowder Trade Association. The members of the association would fix prices, divide territories, and allocate market share according to a formula that gave Du Pont the largest portion. Any manufacturer who refused to join would face predatory pricing until compliance or bankruptcy resolved the matter. The Gunpowder Trade Association was, in plain language, a cartel. It operated for more than 30 years, from 1872 until the federal government intervened in 1907, and during that period it controlled virtually the entire American market for black powder and much of the market for the newer high explosives. Henry du Pont's nephew Lamet served as its first president, but it was Henry who enforced compliance. The association did not merely fix prices. It maintained a system of auditors and inspectors who traveled among member firms to verify that no manufacturer was undercutting the agreed schedule or exceeding its allocated production quota. Firms that violated the agreement were fined. Firms that persisted were purchased outright by Du Pont, absorbed into the family's expanding network of subsidiary mills. The acquisition campaign was methodical. Between 1870 and 1900, the Du Pont Company purchased or gained controlling interest in more than 60 competing powder manufacturers across the United States. Some were bought at fair value. Others were bought at distressed prices after the Gunpowder Trade Association's pricing mechanism had made independent operation unprofitable. The result, by the turn of the century, was a monopoly that controlled an estimated 65 to 70% of all American black powder production and a comparable share of the dynamite market that had emerged after Alfred Nobel's invention of the 1860s. Dynamite itself had transformed the explosives industry. Black powder, the Du Pont family's original product, was a propellant, useful for firearms and for blasting soft rock. Dynamite was an entirely different order of force, capable of shattering hard rock, moving earth at industrial scale, and enabling the construction projects that were remaking the American landscape. The transcontinental railroads, the western mining districts, the Panama Canal, the New York subway tunnels, all of them ran on high explosives. The Du Pont Company moved into dynamite production in the 1880s, building new plants in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and licensing Nobel's patents for American manufacture. By 1890, Du Pont was the largest producer of both black powder and dynamite in the Western Hemisphere. The family that had fled the guillotine was now the indispensable supplier of American state violence and American industrial expansion alike. The paradox was not lost on the Du Pont, though they framed it differently. Henry du Pont, in a letter to a congressional ally in 1893, described the company's position as one of national service rendered through private enterprise. The language was careful. It suggested that the monopoly was not merely profitable but patriotic, that the concentration of American explosives production in a single family's hands was not a market distortion but a strategic asset. The numbers sustained the argument, at least on their own terms. During the Spanish-American War of 1898, Du Pont supplied the overwhelming majority of the smokeless powder used by the United States Navy in the bombardment of Santiago de Cuba. The company had invested heavily in smokeless powder technology in the 1890s, recognizing that the transition from black powder to nitrocellulose-based propellants would render its original product obsolete for military use. The investment paid off. When the Navy needed powder for its new steel warships, DuPont was the only domestic manufacturer capable of producing it in quantity. The scale of the DuPont monopoly at the turn of the 20th century is worth pausing over. The company and its subsidiaries operated over 100 manufacturing plants across the United States. It controlled roughly 2/3 of all American gunpowder production, 3/4 of all dynamite production, and virtually all domestic smokeless powder manufacturing. Its annual revenue exceeded $10 million in a year when the average American worker earned fewer than $500. The Gunpowder Trade Association's price-fixing arrangement had functioned without meaningful interruption for 3 decades, generating margins that allowed the DuPont family to reinvest in plant expansion, research, and the systematic purchase of competitors. The family's personal wealth, held inside the partnership structure that Irénée had designed a century earlier, was estimated at over $60 million by 1900. A figure that placed the DuPonts among the 5 wealthiest families in the United States. And unlike the Rockefellers, who had been dragged before congressional committees and newspaper editors for their consolidation of the oil industry, the DuPonts had operated in relative obscurity. Gunpowder did not generate the public outrage that kerosene did because the public did not think about where gunpowder came from. It simply arrived when the nation needed it, and the nation always needed it. That obscurity was about to end. In 1902, the same year that Theodore Roosevelt's Justice Department began preparing the antitrust case against Standard Oil, the DuPont Company faced a crisis that had nothing to do with the federal government. The senior partners of the old generation were dying. Eugene DuPont, who had led the company since Henry's retirement, died on the 30th of January, 1902, without a designated successor. The surviving senior partners, elderly men who had managed the Brandywine works for decades, concluded that no DuPont of the younger generation was capable of running the enterprise. They proposed to sell the company to its largest competitor, Laughlin and Rand Powder Company. The sale would have ended the dynasty. A century of family control, the compact that Irénée had designed to bind the DuPonts to the powder works forever, would have dissolved in a single transaction between aging partners and a rival firm. The family's monopoly, its political position, its identity as a Delaware institution, all of it would have passed to strangers. But 3 young DuPonts, cousins from different branches of the family, refused to let it happen. Thomas Coleman DuPont was a promoter and speculator who had made money in coal, steel, and streetcar lines outside the family business. Alfred Irénée DuPont was a powder man who had worked in the Brandywine mills since boyhood and considered the company his birthright. Pierre Samuel DuPont II was an accountant and administrator, methodical and reserved, who had studied the modern corporate structures being adopted by Standard Oil and United States Steel. The 3 men presented themselves to the senior partners with an offer to purchase the company at the appraised value of $12 million. The older men, weary and uncertain, accepted. The cousins borrowed against the company's own assets to finance the purchase, a leveraged buyout conducted 80 years before the term existed, and took control of the enterprise their great-grandfather had founded on the Brandywine. The 3 cousins had saved the dynasty, but saving it required modernizing it, and modernizing it required a reckoning with the family compact that had governed the DuPont Company for a century. The partnership structure that Irénée had designed was built for a family of 30 operating a cluster of mills along a single creek. It was not built for a multinational corporation with over 100 plants and 10,000 employees. The cousins incorporated the company, issued stock, and began the process of transforming the DuPont enterprise from a family partnership into a modern industrial corporation. They also began the process of turning on each other. The alliance that had saved the company in 1902 would fracture within a decade, and the fracture would produce a family lawsuit, a personal betrayal, and a permanent division between DuPont branches that would shape the dynasty's politics for the next 80 years. The cousins had rescued the machine. The question was whether the machine, once modernized, still needed the family that had built it. The modernization began with Pierre. Of the three cousins who had purchased the company in 1902, Pierre Samuel du Pont was the quietest and the most deliberate. Coleman was the public figure, a man who built highways and hotels and ran for the United States Senate. Alfred was the sentimentalist, a powder man who loved the Brandywine mills and believed the company belonged to the family in a way that transcended stock certificates. Pierre believed in systems. He had studied the organizational methods of the Pennsylvania Railroad and the management structures that Frederick Winslow Taylor was promoting in the new discipline of industrial efficiency. Within months of the buyout, Pierre began reorganizing the DuPont company along functional lines, creating departments for sales, production, purchasing, and research that reported to a central executive committee. He installed cost accounting systems that tracked the profitability of each plant and each product line with a precision that the old partnership had never attempted. It was the first modern corporate structure in the American explosives industry, and it would become a model studied by the Harvard Business School and by the executives of General Motors, which would later adopt the DuPont organizational chart as its own template. The reorganization worked. Between 1902 and 1907, the DuPont Company's revenues doubled. The cousins consolidated their scattered subsidiaries into a single management hierarchy, closed redundant plants, standardized production methods, and invested in the research laboratories that would eventually transform the company from a powder manufacturer into a chemical empire. But the success of the reorganization also shifted the balance of power among the three cousins. Pierre controlled the executive committee. Coleman controlled the board. Alfred controlled the mills. And the question of who truly owned the company, which had seemed settled by the 1902 buyout, was about to reopen in the most damaging way possible. The break came in 1915 over Coleman's stock. Thomas Coleman du Pont had accumulated a large personal holding in DuPont Company shares, and by 1914 he was in poor health, distracted by his political ambitions in Delaware and looking to sell. He offered his shares first to the company. Pierre, acting as president, arranged a deal in which he and a group of allied DuPont family members would purchase Coleman's shares personally, not through the corporation, at a price of $200 per share. The total transaction was valued at approximately $14 million. Alfred Irénée du Pont was not informed of the deal until it was nearly complete. When he learned that Pierre had arranged to buy Coleman's shares privately, bypassing the company's treasury and excluding other family members from the opportunity, Alfred accused Pierre of betrayal. The shares, Alfred argued, should have been offered to the company itself, which would have distributed the ownership broadly among all DuPont stockholders. By purchasing them privately, Pierre had concentrated an enormous block of voting stock in his own hands and those of his allies, effectively seizing majority control of the DuPont Company in a single transaction. Alfred sued. The lawsuit, filed in the Delaware Court of Chancery in 1915, pitted one branch of the DuPont family against another in a public courtroom. Alfred accused Pierre of breach of fiduciary duty. Pierre's lawyers responded that the transaction was a private stock sale between willing parties, conducted at fair market value, and that the company's board had approved the arrangement. The trial produced testimony that laid bare the personal animosities within the family. Alfred and Pierre had already been estranged over Alfred's divorce and remarriage, which Pierre and the conservative wing of the family considered scandalous. The stock dispute gave the personal grievance a corporate weapon. The court ruled in Pierre's favor in 1917. The decision held that Pierre had acted within his rights as an individual stockholder and that the board's approval of the transaction was valid. Alfred appealed and lost again. The legal battle was over, but the family fracture it produced was permanent. Alfred Irénée du Pont, the powderman who had helped save the company in 1902, was now an outsider in the enterprise his great-grandfather had founded. He relocated to Jacksonville, Florida, and spent the remainder of his life building a separate financial empire in that state, investing in banks, real estate, and public infrastructure, including the funding of a highway bridge across the St. Johns River. He maintained his DuPont stock, but had no voice in the company's direction. The grievance he carried against the Pierre branch would outlast both men and embed itself in the family's internal politics for generations. "They have stolen the company," Alfred wrote to a family ally in 1918, "and they have done it with a handshake and a lawyer." The family was divided, but the federal government was about to divide the company itself. The antitrust case against DuPont had been filed in 1907, 5 years after the cousins' buyout, during the same wave of trust-busting that had targeted Standard Oil, American Tobacco, and the Northern Securities Company. The government alleged that the DuPont Company's acquisition of competitors through the Gunpowder Trade Association constituted an illegal restraint of trade under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The case moved slowly through the courts, delayed by the complexity of the explosives industry and by the company's principal defense, that its monopoly served the national defense, that the concentration of American powder manufacturing in a single company ensured reliable supply for the military, and that breaking the company apart would leave the United States vulnerable in the event of a major war. It was the same argument that Henry du Pont had made in his letters to Congress a decade earlier, refined now by corporate lawyers and presented to federal judges in Wilmington. The verdict came in 1911. The United States Circuit Court ruled that the DuPont Company's control of the American explosives market was indeed an illegal monopoly. The dissolution decree, issued on the 13th of June, 1912, ordered the company broken into 3 separate entities. The DuPont Company would retain its smokeless powder operations and its core chemical research. 2 new companies, Hercules Powder and Atlas Powder, would be spun off to handle the black powder and dynamite businesses that had formed the backbone of the old monopoly. The court directed DuPont to transfer manufacturing plants, patents, and customer contracts to the new firms and to divest its ownership stakes within a specified period. The breakup, on paper, was severe. Hercules Powder received the dynamite operations and a portfolio of blasting products. Atlas Powder received another segment of the commercial explosives business. Together, the 2 spin-offs represented roughly 1/3 of DuPont's pre-breakup revenue and a significant share of its manufacturing capacity. The DuPont Company that emerged from the decree was smaller, narrower, and for the first time in over a century, not the sole dominant force in American explosives. The scale of what had been dismantled tells the story of what the DuPonts had built. At the time of the 1912 decree, the DuPont monopoly encompassed over 100 manufacturing facilities in more than a dozen states. The combined annual output of DuPont and its subsidiaries exceeded 100 million pounds of explosives. The company held more than 200 patents on powder and explosive formulations. The Gunpowder Trade Association, the cartel that Henry DuPont had organized in 1872, had fixed prices across the American market for 4 decades without a single successful legal challenge prior to the 1907 filing. The total value of the assets divided among DuPont, Hercules, and Atlas was estimated at approximately $65 million, a figure that made the DuPont breakup one of the largest antitrust dissolutions in American history to that point, second only to the Standard Oil decision of 1911. But the comparison to Standard Oil reveals the crucial difference. When Standard Oil was broken into 34 companies, John D. Rockefeller retained stock in all of them, but lost operational control. The fragments competed with each other, and the Rockefeller family's grip on the oil industry slowly loosened over the following decades. The DuPont breakup was smaller, more contained, and far less damaging to the family's long-term position. Pierre DuPont retained the presidency of the parent company. The DuPont family retained majority ownership of the surviving entity. The experimental station, the Wilmington Research Laboratory that Pierre had built to develop new chemical products, remained entirely within the parent company, untouched by the divestiture. And the surviving entity, stripped of its black powder and dynamite operations, was now free to pursue the strategy that Pierre had been planning since before the antitrust suit was filed. The strategy was reinvention. Pierre DuPont had watched the chemical industry in Germany and Britain transform coal tar and cellulose into dyes, plastics, and synthetic fibers. He had invested in research laboratories on the Brandywine and at a new facility in Wilmington called the Experimental Station. He had hired chemists, not powdermen, and he had told them to find products that the DuPont company could manufacture and sell in markets that did not depend on war or westward expansion. The antitrust decree, which was supposed to punish the DuPont monopoly, had inadvertently given Pierre exactly what he needed: a reason to abandon the explosives business that had made the family rich, and a mandate to build something new. The irony was not subtle, and Pierre DuPont was not the kind of man to miss it. The federal government had broken his company in order to restore competition to the American explosives market. In doing so, it had released the DuPont company from the very industry that limited its growth. The DuPonts had been powder manufacturers for 110 years. They were about to become something far larger and far more difficult to regulate. The antitrust breakup forced the DuPonts out of explosives, but Pierre DuPont had already decided that gunpowder was the past. The future was chemistry itself, and the profits from the war that was about to engulf Europe would give him the capital to prove it. The war came in August of 1914, and it came with an appetite for explosives that dwarfed anything the 19th century had produced. The armies of France, Britain, and Russia needed smokeless powder in quantities that their own factories could not supply. The DuPont Company, which had spent a decade modernizing its production lines and investing in smokeless powder technology, was the only American manufacturer with the capacity to fill the gap. Between 1914 and 1918, the DuPont Company sold an estimated 40% of all the smokeless powder used by the Allied forces on the Western Front. The company built entirely new manufacturing complexes to meet the demand, including a massive plant at Hopewell, Virginia, that produced gun cotton on an unprecedented scale. The Brandywine mills and the newer plants in New Jersey and Virginia ran around the clock. The company's workforce expanded from 5,000 to over 85,000. Its annual revenue rose from roughly $25 million before the war to over $300 million by 1918. The DuPont family's share of the wartime profits, distributed through the stock and partnership structures Pierre had consolidated, exceeded $200 million. The profits were extraordinary, and they were controversial. When the war ended and the American public began to calculate the cost of the conflict in lives rather than in tonnage, the DuPont family's wartime earnings became a political target. In 1934, Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota convened a special committee of the United States Senate to investigate the role of American munitions manufacturers in promoting the country's entry into the war. The Nye Committee hearings, which ran from 1934 to 1936, produced testimony and documents that portrayed DuPont, along with other arms manufacturers, as profiteers who had encouraged military intervention for commercial gain. The press called them the Merchants of Death, and the phrase attached itself to the DuPont name with a tenacity that decades of corporate philanthropy would fail to dissolve. The DuPont family denied the characterization. Pierre DuPont testified before the Nye Committee that the company had filled Allied orders as a matter of industrial capacity, not political advocacy, and that the profits had been reinvested in American manufacturing and research. The testimony was technically accurate. The profits had indeed been reinvested, but where they had been reinvested revealed the scale of Pierre DuPont's ambition. The first reinvestment was in General Motors. Pierre DuPont began purchasing General Motors stock in 1914, initially as a personal investment on the advice of a DuPont company treasurer named John Jacob Raskob. By 1920, Pierre had accumulated enough shares to become the chairman of the General Motors Board of Directors, and the DuPont company itself invested approximately $49 million in General Motors stock, acquiring a 23% ownership stake in what was becoming the largest automobile manufacturer in the world. The DuPont family did not merely invest in General Motors, it governed General Motors. Pierre served as chairman from 1915 to 1929 and personally recruited Alfred Sloan, whose decentralized management structure would define American corporate organization for the rest of the century. DuPont executives filled senior management positions throughout the company. DuPont chemical products, including paints, lacquers, antifreeze, and synthetic fabrics for upholstery, were sold to General Motors as a captive customer, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in intercompany revenue over the following decades. The relationship between the two corporations was so intertwined that the Department of Justice would eventually argue it constituted an illegal restraint of trade. That argument would take decades to reach a courtroom. In the meantime, the second reinvestment was in chemistry itself. Using the wartime profits as capital, the DuPont Company built what became the largest private research operation in the United States. The experimental station in Wilmington, Delaware, expanded into a campus of laboratories employing hundreds of chemists, physicists, and engineers. The company recruited Wallace Hume Carruthers from Harvard University in 1928 and gave him a mandate that would have been unimaginable in the old powder days: conduct fundamental research into the chemistry of polymers with no immediate commercial application required. The mandate was a gamble on the idea that pure science, funded at industrial scale, would produce products that could replace the explosives business the family had lost. The gamble paid off on a scale that justified every dollar Pierre DuPont had invested. In 1930, DuPont chemists working in collaboration with researchers at General Motors and its Frigidaire division developed Freon, a chlorofluorocarbon refrigerant that replaced the toxic and flammable gases previously used in household refrigerators and air conditioning systems. Freon made mechanical cooling safe for ordinary homes and commercial buildings, and DuPont held the patent. In 1935, Carruthers and his team at the experimental station synthesized a polymer they called nylon, the first fully synthetic fiber in history. The achievement cost Carruthers his life in a different sense. He suffered from severe depression throughout his years at Du Pont. And in April of 1937, 2 years after the nylon breakthrough and months before the company announced the discovery to the public, Carruthers checked into a Philadelphia hotel room and took a lethal dose of potassium cyanide dissolved in lemon juice. He was 41 years old. The company mourned him briefly and proceeded with commercialization. Nylon stockings went on sale in 1940 and sold 64 million pairs in their first year. The product transformed the textile industry, generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, and gave the DuPont Company an identity that transcended explosives. The old powder manufacturer was now a materials company, and its materials were in the clothing, kitchens, and automobiles of millions of American households. The inventions continued for decades. Teflon, a non-stick fluoropolymer discovered accidentally in 1938 by a DuPont chemist named Roy Plunkett, found applications in cookware, industrial coatings, and aerospace engineering. Lucite, a transparent acrylic resin, replaced glass in applications where weight and shatter resistance mattered. Dacron, a polyester fiber, entered the textile market in the 1950s. Kevlar, a para-aramid fiber 5 times stronger than steel by weight, was developed by DuPont chemist Stephanie Kwolek in 1965 and would become the standard material for ballistic body armor used by police and military forces worldwide. Each product extended the DuPont Company's reach into a different sector of American life, and each product carried the DuPont name as a mark of chemical innovation. The company adopted a slogan in 1935 that captured the self-image Pierre DuPont had cultivated: "Better things for better living through chemistry." The phrase was not merely advertising. It was a statement of dynastic identity. The DuPonts had been powder manufacturers for over a century, and the powder had made them rich, but also dangerous, tainted by explosion and war. Chemistry offered a cleaner mythology. The family that had armed the nation's wars now clothed its women, cooled its homes, and coated its cookware. The transformation was so thorough that by the middle of the 20th century, most Americans associated the DuPont name with nylon stockings and Teflon pans, not with gunpowder and the merchants of death hearings. The scale of the chemical empire at its peak deserves the same reckoning as the powder monopoly that preceded it. By 1960, the DuPont Company employed over 100,000 workers in plants across the United States and in more than a dozen foreign countries. Its annual revenue exceeded $2 billion. It held more than 1,000 active patents on chemical products and processes. Its research laboratories had produced or commercialized more than 40 synthetic materials that entered everyday American life, from automobile tires to spacecraft heat shields. The General Motors stake, which Pierre DuPont had begun accumulating in 1914, had grown to represent one of the largest single corporate investments in American history. When the United States Supreme Court ruled in 1957 that DuPont's ownership of General Motors stock violated the Clayton Antitrust Act and ordered the family to divest, the forced sale distributed approximately $3 billion in General Motors shares to DuPont stockholders. The divestiture made the DuPont family, already among the wealthiest in America, substantially wealthier still, because the shares they received as individual stockholders were now liquid assets rather than locked corporate holdings. The General Motors divestiture was the second time the federal government had tried to limit the DuPont family's economic power, and the second time the result had enriched the family rather than diminished it. The antitrust breakup of 1912 had freed the company to become a chemical empire. The General Motors divestiture of the late 1950s released billions of dollars in personal wealth to individual DuPont family members. The pattern was consistent. Every external attempt to constrain the dynasty's power converted one form of concentrated wealth into another, often larger, form. But the chemical century carried a cost that the DuPonts would not reckon with for decades. The freon that made household refrigeration safe would, by the 1980s, be identified as the primary cause of ozone depletion in the Earth's stratosphere. The Teflon and the family of fluorinated compounds that DuPont manufactured under various trade names would, by the 21st century, be identified as persistent environmental contaminants present in the blood of virtually every living American. The products that had transformed the DuPont name from a powder manufacturer into a symbol of modern chemistry were, in ways that no one at the experimental station had anticipated or disclosed, poisoning the same households they had promised to improve. That future reckoning lay in the future. In the middle of the 20th century, the DuPont Company was the largest chemical manufacturer in the world, and the DuPont family controlled not only the company, but the state in which it was headquartered. The family's deepest investment was not in any laboratory or factory. It was in Delaware itself, where the DuPonts had built something no antitrust suit could reach and no stock divestiture could undo. The DuPont family's relationship with the state of Delaware did not begin as a political project. It began as a geographic fact. The Brandywine mills were in Delaware, and the workers who operated them lived in Delaware, and the company's tax obligations were paid to Delaware. But what had started as proximity became, over the course of a century, something closer to possession. By the middle of the 20th century, the DuPont family had woven itself so thoroughly into the political, economic, and civic infrastructure of the state that distinguishing between Delaware's public institutions and the family's private interests required an effort that most Delawareans had stopped making. The political infiltration began with Thomas Coleman DuPont, the same cousin who had helped rescue the company in 1902. Coleman was the most publicly ambitious of the three cousins, a man who understood that business power undefended by political power was business power waiting to be taken away. In 1906, he began building a highway that would run the entire length of the state, from Wilmington in the north to the Maryland border in the south. He financed the road himself, at a personal cost of approximately $4 million, and then donated it to the state of Delaware as a public road. The Coleman-DuPont Highway, as it was called, was the first modern divided highway in the United States. It was also, in practical terms, a campaign contribution that could not be refused. A man who had given Delaware its primary transportation corridor was a man who could ask Delaware for nearly anything. Coleman asked for a seat in the United States Senate. He was appointed in 1921 to fill a vacancy and then elected in his own right in 1924, serving until 1928. When a Wilmington newspaper editor questioned whether the highway donation constituted an improper attempt to purchase political influence, Coleman replied with the directness of a man who saw no meaningful distinction between philanthropy and politics. "I have built the road because the state needed it," he said, "and I have run for the Senate because the state needed that as well." He was not the only DuPont in public office. Members of the family served in the Delaware state legislature throughout the early 20th century. A DuPont served as governor. DuPont relatives and allies filled seats on state commissions, boards, and judicial benches. The family did not always hold office directly. It did not need to. The DuPont network in Delaware operated through a web of law firms, banks, and corporate boards that connected the family to every significant decision in the state's governance without requiring a DuPont nameplate on every door. The mechanism that made this possible was not secret. It was structural. Delaware's economy depended on the DuPont Company in the way that a mill town depends on its mill. The company was the state's largest private employer. Its taxes constituted a substantial share of state revenue. Its executives served on the boards of Delaware's banks, hospitals, universities, and cultural institutions. When the DuPont Company expanded, Delaware prospered. When the DuPont Company contracted, Delaware suffered. This dependency gave the family a form of political leverage that required no campaign donations, no backroom deals, and no explicit threats. The leverage was simply understood, the way gravity is understood. A legislature that passed a tax unfavorable to the DuPont Company was a legislature that risked the economic foundation of its own state. The DuPonts used this leverage to shape Delaware's legal code in ways that served dynastic wealth. Delaware's incorporation statutes, which became the most permissive in the nation over the course of the 20th century, were drafted and revised with input from lawyers who represented the DuPont family's corporate and personal interests. The state's trust laws, which allowed the creation of perpetual trusts that could shelter wealth across unlimited generations, were among the most favorable to dynastic preservation anywhere in the United States. Delaware's estate tax was structured to minimize the burden on large family holdings, and the state's courts, particularly the Court of Chancery, developed a body of corporate law that attracted companies from across the country to incorporate in Delaware, generating franchise tax revenue that reduced the state's dependence on other forms of taxation and created a shared interest between Delaware's government and its largest corporate residents. The result was a state whose legal architecture functioned in significant part as a preservation mechanism for the DuPont fortune. The family did not write the laws alone. But the laws that Delaware wrote and the legal culture that Delaware cultivated reflected the priorities of a state whose dominant institution was a single family-controlled corporation. More than half of all publicly traded companies in the United States would eventually be incorporated in Delaware, drawn by the flexibility of the state's corporate code. The DuPonts benefited not only as the architects of that code, but as its most prominent tenants. The estates told the same story in stone and landscape. Winterthur, the DuPont estate northwest of Wilmington, encompassed nearly 1,000 acres of Delaware farmland and housed one of the largest collections of American decorative arts in existence. Henry Francis DuPont, a great-grandson of Eleuthère, spent decades assembling the collection and designing the 175-room mansion that displayed it. Longwood Gardens, Pierre DuPont's personal estate in nearby Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, occupied more than 1,000 acres of conservatories, fountains, and formal gardens that Pierre had designed himself, modeled on the great estates of Europe. Nemours, the estate that Alfred Irénée DuPont built after his exile from the company, sat on 300 acres outside Wilmington and featured a modified Louis XVI chateau surrounded by French formal gardens. Hagley, the original Brandywine mill site, was preserved as a museum of industrial history by the DuPont family's Eleutherian Mills-Hagley Foundation. These were not merely homes, they were declarations. A family that maintained 4 estates of this scale within a single county was a family that intended to be seen and a family that intended to remain. The philanthropy that accompanied the estates served the same purpose. DuPont money built and maintained Delaware's public schools in the early 20th century, at a time when the state's education system was among the poorest in the nation. Pierre du Pont personally funded the construction of more than 80 school buildings for black students in Delaware during the 1920s at a cost of approximately $6 million. The gesture was genuine. It was also, inescapably, an act of power. A family that built a state's schools was a family that the state could not afford to oppose. The numbers make the dependency concrete. At the peak of the du Pont family's influence in Delaware, the DuPont Company and its affiliates employed more than 25,000 workers in a state whose total population was under 600,000. DuPont-related tax revenue accounted for a substantial share of the state budget. More than a dozen members of the DuPont family held elected or appointed public office in Delaware over the course of the 20th century, including one United States senator, one governor, and multiple state legislators. The family's combined real estate holdings in New Castle County, the northernmost and most politically significant of Delaware's 3 counties, exceeded 10,000 acres. The DuPont family foundations, trusts, and philanthropic entities collectively held assets in the hundreds of millions of dollars, directed by family members and family-appointed trustees, and distributed to Delaware institutions that depended on the funding for basic operations. No other American family achieved this degree of integration with a single state's governance. The Rockefellers influenced New York but did not own it. The Mellons shaped Pittsburgh but did not redesign Pennsylvania's tax code around their fortune. The D.U. Ponts did both, and they did it in a state small enough that a single family's economic weight was sufficient to tilt every institution in the same direction. Delaware's population never exceeded 1 million during the century of DuPont dominance. The family did not need to capture a large electorate. It needed only to sustain a dependency so thorough that the question of whether Delaware served the DuPonts or the DuPonts served Delaware became, for most practical purposes, unanswerable. The system held for generations because each generation produced DuPonts willing to maintain it. The sons worked in the company, the daughters married within the network. The trusts preserved the capital. The estates anchored the family's physical presence in the state. But a system that depends on generational loyalty depends on something no fortune can guarantee: that each successive generation will accept the obligations that come with the name. By the 1960s, the DuPont family had grown too large and too dispersed to operate as a single political and economic unit. The branches that Pierre and Alfred had fractured in 1915 had produced separate lineages with separate interests, and the youngest members of those lineages were inheriting wealth without inheriting the institutional purpose that had created it. The DuPont system, the interlocking machine of company, family, and state, had operated for over a century and a half. But the machine required something more than money to function. It required that each generation believe the machine was worth serving, and that belief, unlike the fortune itself, could not be placed in a trust. The fracture between the Pierre branch and the Alfred branch of the DuPont family had never healed. Alfred Irene DuPont died in 1935 in Jacksonville, Florida, far from the Brandywine, his fortune invested in Florida banks and real estate, his grievance against Pierre's descendants still intact. His widow, Jessie Ball DuPont, managed the Alfred I DuPont estate for decades after his death, building it into one of the largest charitable trusts in the American South. But the Alfred branch's distance from the company was permanent. The DuPonts, who controlled the DuPont Company in the middle of the 20th century, were Pierre's people, and they governed the enterprise with the assumption that the Pierre branch's dominance was settled history. It was not. Within the Pierre branch itself, the problem of succession grew more acute with each passing generation. Pierre DuPont had died in 1954, and the generation of executives who had worked directly under him were retiring or dying by the 1960s. The company had grown into one of the 10 largest industrial corporations in the United States, with operations on 6 continents, a research budget that exceeded the gross domestic product of some small nations, and a management hierarchy that employed more professional administrators than the du Pont family had living members. The disproportion was the problem. A company of 100,000 employees could not be governed by a family, no matter how wealthy or how determined. It required professional management, and professional management required that the family step back from operational control. The stepping back was not voluntary. It was forced by the arithmetic of inheritance. Irene du Pont, the founder, had 5 surviving children. Those children produced more children, who produced more children, and by the middle of the 20th century, the du Pont family tree had branched into dozens of separate households, each holding shares in the du Pont Company through the trust structures that previous generations had designed to preserve the fortune. The trusts worked. The fortune was preserved. But the concentration of ownership was not. By 1970, the du Pont family's collective stake in the du Pont Company, while still enormous in absolute dollar terms, had been diluted across so many individual trusts and family members that no single du Pont or du Pont branch held enough stock to exercise unilateral control over the board of directors. The company's response was to professionalize. In the 1950s and 60s, du Pont promoted a series of non-family executives into senior management positions that had previously been reserved by tradition, if not by law, for du Pont family members. The trend accelerated through the 1970s. Crawford Greenwalt, who had married a du Pont and served as president from 1948 to 1962, was the last chief executive to hold the position through a combination of competence and family connection. His successors were career managers, men who had risen through the company's chemical and administrative divisions on merit rather than bloodline. By 1971, the du Pont Company's board of directors included more independent directors than family members for the first time in the company's history. The family did not surrender its position without resistance. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, du Pont family members debated the question of whether the company should remain a family-governed institution or complete its transformation into a publicly managed corporation. The debate was conducted not in boardrooms, but in the parlors of the Wilmington estates and at family gatherings where du Pont, from different branches, argued over the meaning of the compact that Irene had designed a century and a half earlier. Some family members believed the compact required perpetual family control. Others argued that the compact's true purpose, the preservation of the enterprise, was better served by professional management than by the appointment of du Ponts, who happened to hold the right surname but lacked the temperament or the training to run a multinational chemical corporation. The pragmatists won, though the victory was slow, and its implications were not fully understood by the family members who accepted it. The transition began in earnest when Lamont du Pont Copeland, who had served as president in the early 1960s, stepped down in favor of executives who had been recruited from outside the family network. Irving Shapiro, a lawyer from Minneapolis with no du Pont family connection, was appointed chairman and chief executive in 1973. The first person outside the du Pont bloodline to hold the company's top position in its 171-year history. The appointment was a watershed. It signaled that the du Pont Company, while still bearing the family name, was no longer the family's instrument. It was a public corporation that happened to have a large number of shareholders named du Pont. The older generation of du Ponts, Men and women who had grown up believing that the company existed to serve the family and the family existed to serve the company, watched the transition with a discomfort they could articulate but not reverse. The corporate separation accelerated in the 1980s through a series of transactions that redefined the company's identity. In 1981, Du Pont acquired Conoco, one of the largest American oil companies, in a deal valued at approximately $7.8 billion. The acquisition was the largest corporate merger in American history at that time, and it transformed Du Pont from a chemical company into a diversified energy and materials conglomerate. The Conoco deal was driven by the company's professional management, not by the Du Pont family. Family members were informed of the acquisition after the strategy had been set, and several later described the experience as the moment when they understood that the company bearing their name had become a separate institution with its own logic, its own ambitions, and its own definition of success that no longer required the family's approval or participation. The Conoco acquisition also attracted the attention of the Seagram Company, the Canadian spirits conglomerate controlled by the Bronfman family. Edgar Bronfman Sr. launched a hostile bid for Conoco in the summer of 1981, and when Conoco's board accepted Du Pont's offer instead, Bronfman pivoted and acquired a substantial stake in the Du Pont Company itself. For the first time in the dynasty's history, an outside family with no connection to the Du Pont bloodline owned a significant block of Du Pont stock and sat on the Du Pont board of directors. The Bronfman stake, which eventually reached approximately 24% of the company's shares, represented a concentration of ownership that rivaled what any single Du Pont branch could muster. The family that had designed the compact to keep outsiders away from the powder works now shared its boardroom with a Canadian liquor dynasty. The Du Pont family's response to the Bronfman intrusion was fragmented, which was itself evidence of the dynasty's decline as a governing institution. Some family members welcomed the Bronfman investment as a stabilizing force. Others viewed it as an invasion. There was no family consensus, no unified strategy, and no Du Pont with the authority to speak for the clan. The family compact that Irénée had written in 1811 to bind the Du Ponts into a single economic unit had produced, by the 1980s, a family so large and so dispersed that collective action was impossible. The numbers tell the story of dissolution. By the late 20th century, the Du Pont family had an estimated 2,000 or more living members spread across multiple states and several countries. The trusts and foundations that held Du Pont wealth collectively controlled assets in the billions of dollars, but the distributions from those trusts were divided among so many beneficiaries that individual Du Ponts ranged from extraordinarily wealthy to merely comfortable. Some lived in the Wilmington mansions. Others lived in suburban houses in states that had no connection to the Brandywine or to the company. The family's combined shareholding in the Du Pont Company, which had once represented majority control, had declined to an estimated 15 to 20% of outstanding shares by the 1990s. Board seats that had once been held by Du Pont family members as a matter of institutional tradition passed to independent directors, corporate partners, and, after the Conoco acquisition, to Bronfman representatives. The Wilmington estates remained in family hands, maintained by the trusts and foundations, but the estates were now museums and gardens open to the public, not the private compounds of a governing dynasty. The Hagley Museum drew tourists to the original powder mill site. Longwood Gardens sold admission tickets. Winterthur hosted school groups. The monuments to Du Pont Power had become attractions, and the public walked through them without needing to know the name of the family that had built them. The Du Pont family had built a machine designed to perpetuate itself across generations. The machine had worked for over a century, concentrating wealth, maintaining political control, and producing heirs who understood their obligation to the enterprise. But the machine's very success had been its undoing. The company grew too large for family management. The fortune grew too dispersed for family control. The legal structures that preserved the wealth simultaneously dissolved the concentration of power that the wealth had been designed to support. The du Ponts were still rich. They were no longer in charge. "The name is on the building," one du Pont family member reportedly remarked to a Wilmington journalist in the early 1990s, "but the building does not call us back." By the end of the 20th century, the du Pont dynasty had become something rare in American history. A family that still possessed enormous wealth, but no longer possessed the institution that had created it. The name remained. The power structure behind it had quietly dissolved, and in the absence of institutional purpose, the family began to produce the kind of heirs that dynasties without purpose have always produced, in every century and in every country where great fortunes outlast the discipline that built them. John Eleuthère du Pont was born in 1938 into the wealthiest branch of the wealthiest family in Delaware. He inherited Lisiter Hall, a sprawling estate in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania, and a fortune derived from the du Pont trusts that insulated him from every material consequence that ordinary life imposes. He never needed to work. He never needed to answer to anyone. He never needed to develop the discipline that the early du Ponts had enforced through the family compact, because the compact no longer functioned and the family no longer required its members to serve the enterprise. John du Pont was free to pursue whatever interested him, and what interested him, by the 1980s, was wrestling. He converted a portion of his estate into a training facility he called Foxcatcher Farm, recruited Olympic and world-class wrestlers to live and train on the property, and installed himself as the team's patron, mentor, and, in his own estimation, coach. The wrestlers tolerated his presence because his money funded their training. The du Pont family tolerated his eccentricities because the family no longer operated as a collective institution capable of intervening in the behavior of its individual members. For years, John du Pont's conduct grew more erratic, more paranoid, and more dangerous, and for years, no one with the authority or the motive to stop him did so. The wealth that had once been governed by the family compact now functioned as a shield, and the shield held until the 26th of January, 1996, when John du Pont drove to the farmhouse on his estate where Olympic gold medalist Dave Schultz lived with his family and shot Schultz dead in the driveway. The siege that followed lasted 2 days. Police surrounded the mansion. John du Pont refused to emerge. He was eventually arrested, tried, and convicted of third-degree murder in 1997. He was sentenced to 13 to 30 years in a psychiatric facility and died in custody in December 2010. The murder was senseless, the product of untreated mental illness amplified by unlimited wealth, and the absence of any institutional structure that might have compelled treatment or accountability before the killing occurred. The du Pont family issued no collective statement. There was no collective to issue one. The Foxcatcher murder was not an anomaly. It was a data point in a pattern that the du Pont family's size and privacy had kept largely invisible. The dynasty that had once governed itself through the compact, the partnership, and the shared residence on the Brandywine had fragmented into hundreds of separate households, and the behavior of individual du Ponts was no longer the family's concern. The name still conferred privilege. It no longer conferred obligation. The extent of that privilege became a matter of national outrage in March of 2014, when court records revealed the sentencing of Robert H. Richards IV, a du Pont family heir, on charges of fourth-degree rape of his own daughter. Richards had pleaded guilty in June of 2008 to sexually assaulting his 3-year-old child. Superior Court Judge John du sentenced Richards in 2009 to 8 years in prison, but suspended the sentence to probation, writing in her order that the defendant will not fare well in a prison environment. Richards served no time in prison. He was placed on a sex offender registry, ordered into a treatment program, and returned to his life. The sentencing went largely unnoticed for 5 years, buried in Delaware court records, until a civil lawsuit filed by Richards's former wife brought the case to public attention. The reaction was immediate and severe. News outlets across the country reported that a du Pont heir had been convicted of raping his own child and had received probation from a Delaware judge who had determined that prison would be too difficult for him. The implication, which neither the judge nor the defense attorneys disputed, was that Richards's wealth and social position had influenced the sentence. In a state where the du Pont name had shaped the judiciary, the legislature, and the tax code for over a century, the possibility that the name had also shaped a criminal sentence was not a conspiracy theory. It was a structural observation. The Richards case did something the Foxcatcher murder had not. The murder could be attributed to individual madness, to the particular pathology of one disturbed man on one isolated estate. The sentencing could not. It implicated the system itself, the Delaware judiciary that operated within the gravitational field of the du Pont name, and it raised the question of whether the institutional capture that the family had spent a century building had extended into the administration of criminal justice. The du Pont family again issued no collective response. While the family's private scandals consumed headlines, the company that bore the family name was generating a crisis of its own, one measured not in criminal charges, but in parts per billion. For decades, the du Pont Company had manufactured a class of fluorinated chemicals known collectively as per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. The most widely used of these compounds was perfluorooctanoic acid, known by its trade name C8, which was a key ingredient in the production of Teflon. Du Pont had been manufacturing C8 at its Washington Works plant in Parkersburg, West Virginia, since the 1950s, and for decades the company had discharged the chemical into the Ohio River and the surrounding groundwater. Internal du Pont studies, conducted as early as the 1960s, had identified health risks associated with C8 exposure, including links to kidney cancer, testicular cancer, thyroid disease, and complications in pregnancy. The company did not disclose these findings to regulators or to the communities whose water supplies were contaminated. The concealment continued for decades until a Parkersburg farmer named Wilbur Tennant, whose cattle were dying from exposure to contaminated water, retained an attorney named Robert Belot, who spent the next 20 years litigating against du Pont in a series of cases that would ultimately expose the scope of the contamination. The numbers are difficult to absorb. By the time the litigation reached settlement, studies had identified PFAS contamination in the drinking water of more than 100 million Americans. The C8 Science Panel, a research body established by the settlement of a class action lawsuit in 2004, linked C8 exposure to 6 categories of disease across a study population of nearly 70,000 people in the Mid-Ohio Valley. Du Pont and its corporate successor, Chemours, agreed to settlements exceeding $1 billion. The Environmental Protection Agency designated PFAS as a significant public health concern. Researchers identified PFAS compounds in the blood of 98% of Americans tested, earning the chemicals the designation forever chemicals because they do not break down in the human body or in the natural environment. The Chemours spin-off itself was an act of corporate architecture that mirrored, in a darker register, the antitrust breakups that had twice reshaped the DuPont Company. In 2015, the DuPont Company created Chemours as a separate entity and transferred to it the bulk of the company's PFAS-related liabilities, including the environmental contamination claims, the health studies, and the regulatory obligations. The transaction was designed to insulate the parent company from the financial consequences of the contamination. Chemours, burdened with billions of dollars in potential liability, was left to absorb the lawsuits while the DuPont Company, soon to merge with Dow Chemical in a deal completed in 2017, continued under a restructured corporate identity. The DuPont family, by this point, had no operational role in any of these decisions. The family name was being used by a corporation that the family no longer controlled. In a strategy, the family had no power to approve or prevent. The DuPont dynasty did not end with a single cataclysm. It ended with a series of revelations that accumulated across decades and converted the family name from an asset into evidence. The gunpowder that Irénée DuPont had milled on the Brandywine in 1804 had built a fortune. The fortune had built a chemical empire. The chemical empire had built a political machine. And the political machine had operated for so long and had embedded itself so deeply into the infrastructure of American industrial life that when the dynasty finally broke, it broke not from the outside, but from within. The family grew too large to govern itself. The company grew too large to be governed by the family. The chemicals grew too persistent to be contained by the company. And the name, which had once opened every door in Delaware and every contract in Washington, became the name attached to poisoned water, to a murdered wrestler, to a child who was assaulted by her own father and whose attacker was told by a Delaware judge that prison would be too hard for him. The Brandywine mills, where Irénée DuPont first ground black powder, are preserved today as the Hagley Museum and Library, a quiet campus of stone buildings along the creek in northern Delaware. The powder yards are silent. The grinding stones are still. The DuPont family estates that line the Brandywine Valley are open to the public, their gardens maintained by foundations, their rooms toured by visitors who admire the furniture and the architecture without necessarily understanding the system that produced them. The DuPont Company, merged and restructured and renamed, continues to operate in forms that bear little resemblance to the family partnership that Irénée designed in 1811. The chemicals that the company manufactured under the DuPont name are in the water, in the soil, and in the blood of nearly every American alive today. The dynasty is over. The consequences are not. The story of the DuPont family is the story of what happens when a single institution, family-controlled and war-funded, embeds itself so deeply into the infrastructure of a nation that removing it requires the institution to consume itself. The DuPonts did not fall because the government broke them, though the government tried 3 times. They fell because the machine they built, the company, the state, the chemical empire, outgrew the family that built it, and the family, stripped of its purpose, could not survive what it had become. There are other stories like this one, other dynasties that built American power and then watched it slip beyond their control. If this tale of the DuPont family has held some value, please like and subscribe. The investigation is ongoing.